With the general disenchantment brought about by capitalism, the materiality of culture has become more and more transparent. Culture has always been driven by material forces. That is to say, culture is a result of the material factors that enable it to exist and reproduce. But this realization can be more readily supported now that a general desacralization of all things has occurred. Culture is a very general term, and it's often used as a floating signifier. It tends to be used in a circular fashion. In certain pernicious cases, you might say it operates in a manner similar to certain thought-eliminating cliches. Things are a certain way because, well, it's part of our culture. So we have to be precise when we use the term in order to avoid this pitfall. As understood by Jameson, culture is at least in part a function of media, and so media becomes critically important in the course of understanding culture in general. Media is quite a heavy term itself. There are three lenses through which we can analyze media: aesthetics, technology, and social institutions, with aesthetics referring to the visual and stylistic aspects, technology referring to the tools and platforms used to create and distribute media, and social institutions referring to the cultural, economic, and political context in which media is produced and consumed. Art is just one subset of media, but it is often a particularly generative subject in terms of its telling nature with respect to other aspects of society. It has become generally accepted that the dominant form of art in the modern age is film. Over time, film has displaced the primacy of literature, but Jameson identifies a new candidate that has the potential to garner a certain degree of cultural hegemony: video. Its dual manifestations being commercial television and experimental video. This means that video as a medium has the potential to shape and influence cultural norms, values, and beliefs in ways that other mediums simply can't in modern times due to the relative accessibility of these respective mediums. Television is generally a more convenient form of entertainment than, say, literature. Because of this, TV is necessarily going to play a more influential role in our broader culture. Jameson notes that memory seems to play no role whatsoever in television, commercial or otherwise. Jameson was writing in the 80s. Perhaps it's now the case that memory has at least cultivated a niche in TV through a process of cultural osmosis, though it would be difficult to make a case for that by focusing on mainstream TV. Even outlets like the History Channel generally tend to reject any historicizing tendency in favor of navel-gazing along the lines of Ancient Aliens and base forms of reality TV such as Pawn Stars. It is still the case that TV as a medium tends to focus on entertainment and immediacy rather than reflection and historical context. A simplistic example of this is your run-of-the-mill sitcom, which necessarily resets in an iterative fashion each episode. No matter what happens during the episode, every character must go back to a kind of stasis point akin to a hellish eternal recurrence. The economic realities of the entertainment industry have, at times, necessitated this basic formula. Boredom is useful, as it is a symptom of certain limitations. Aesthetic boredom is an interesting problem because it challenges our underlying assumptions about art. We must avoid axiological assumptions when it comes to art. Enduring a strange experimental video for half an hour might strike one as totally unbearable, but half an hour in other contexts, for instance, waiting for a train, isn't generally perceived to be that long. When it comes to experimental art, we might assume the boredom we're feeling when we engage with it is an intentional provocation on the part of the filmmaker. But it's impossible to establish this on the basis of the work itself. Jameson finds technology to be informative here. The technological appropriation of subjectivity has given rise to a situation in which temporal arts, such as video, have the potential to emulate in certain respects our sense of time through various techniques such as editing, pacing, and sound design. This phenomenon is what we might call fictive time. While fictive time is not generally a product of experimental film, on the contrary, most experimental works tend to reject fictive time by virtue of the various operations at play. Commercial television has effectively created a simulacrum of fictive time. The involvement of machines in the process of human subjectivity is properly understood through a materialist analysis, or rather a general emphasis on how economic and technological factors shape our experiences and understanding of the world. E.P. Thompson's essay, Time, Work Discipline, and Industrial Capitalism, discusses the effects of the introduction of the chronometer into the workplace. He argues that the mechanical clock introduced into the workplace during the 18th century played a central role in shaping the capitalist work discipline and the organization of work time. He shows how the clock became a means of measuring and regulating the worker's time, turning it into a commodity to be bought and sold. He also analyzes how clock time became the standard time, which replaced natural time in people's lives. Thompson's argument is that the introduction of the clock and standard time was a key moment in the development of industrial capitalism and had a profound impact on the way we experience time and work. The epoch of capitalism can be periodized or conceptually broken up in accordance with major systemic crises and the subsequent adaptations developed and carried out in order to maintain the capitalist mode of production as the general economic base of society. Mercantilism, which emerged in the 16th and 17th centuries, can be characterized by the rise of commercial capitalism and the formation of nation-states. In this early proto-capitalist stage, the focus is on trade and the accumulation of gold and silver, and the main capitalist actors are the merchants and merchants' capital. Industrial capitalism, which emerged in the 18th and 19th centuries, can be characterized by the rise of industrialization, the factory system, and the growth of the working class. In this stage, the means of production are primarily industrial, and the main capitalist actors are industrial capitalists, and the focus is on the production and sale of goods. Monopoly capitalism, which emerged in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, can be characterized by the concentration of capital and the emergence of monopolies and trusts, as well as the increased role of financial capital. In this stage, the focus is on the control of markets and the extraction of super profits through imperialistic ventures. The primary actors are finance capitalists and the state, which is increasingly involved in the economy. Late capitalism is marked by the ever-increasing financialization of the economy, where the mass production of goods and services gives way to the production of financial assets and derivatives. More and more complex ways of administering debt are developed. This leads to the creation of massive amounts of fictitious capital, which is divorced from the production of the real economy. In the era of so-called late capitalism, video is closely related to the development of more and more sophisticated forms of information technology, and therefore video is perhaps the quintessential medium of late capitalism. The development of video technology, especially digital video, has allowed for the creation and distribution of media on an unprecedented scale, and has also led to the development of new forms of media such as video games, streaming, and virtual reality. These forms of media have become central to the way we consume and interact with media in late capitalism and have come to play an increasingly important role in shaping our culture and society. The various problems associated with analyzing an experimental video are characteristic of problems that can be associated with postmodernism more generally. Totalizing logics and frameworks have been called into question. Grand narratives are now somewhat dubious as a means to make at least some definitive statements about a given text. The displacement of the term work in favor of text in critical discourse is also deeply symptomatic in this context. The notion that a work of art functions autonomously in some sense, as the formalist claimed, has now been problematized to the point of annihilation. Jean-François Lyotard, a French philosopher and sociologist, is known for his influential definition of postmodernism as, quote, an incredulity towards meta-narratives. In the postmodern condition, individuals and groups are skeptical of grand overarching explanations or narratives that claim to provide a comprehensive understanding of the world and human experience. These meta-narratives can be religious, philosophical, political, scientific, or historical in nature. Note that Jameson has titled this chapter Surrealism Without the Unconscious. Of course, the Freudian concept of the unconscious is precisely one of those meta-narratives continuously called into question as postmodernism has run its course. Here, Jameson has set out to understand the implications of analyzing a surreal text when the interpretive framework of a meta-narrative, such as Freud's psychoanalysis, has been systematically excluded from the broader discourse. In the course of analyzing an experimental film called AlienNATION, Jameson noted the following. To describe afterward the stream of images of all kinds is necessarily to violate the perpetual present of the image and to reorganize the few fragments that remain in the memory according to schemes which probably reveal more about the reading mind than the text itself. Do we try to turn it back into a story of some kind? Jameson is suggesting that the act of describing a scene or an image is inherently distortive in that it ruptures the sense of presence that the work elicits in that precise moment. In order to describe a scene, there's a process of cognition at play that is not entirely analogous to experiencing the work firsthand. Jameson says, or at some more critically sophisticated level, do we at least try to sort the material out into thematic blocks and rhythms and repunctuate it with beginnings and endings, with graphs or rising and falling emotivity, climaxes, dead passages, transitions, recapitulations, and the like? Jameson is offering a common alternative method for analyzing and interpreting a stream of images, like those in a film or a TV show, rather than trying to narrate the events depicted. This approach involves organizing the images into themes or patterns and mapping out structural elements such as beginnings, endings, and emotional highs and lows in order to perform a more in-depth analysis and interpretation of the work. The philosophical paradigm of ontology, by which concepts are placed systematically in a hierarchical fashion according to their supposed status on a spectrum between natural and artificial, is perhaps misleading when it comes to an experimental film like AlienNATION, since the natural is depicted as somehow lower in fidelity, degraded, and the artificial no longer suggests any stability enabled by technology, as with prior artistic movements such as Cubism, but rather the noise of life in the postmodern trajectory. Sensory overload. In this context, the distinction between natural and artificial becomes less clear and may not accurately reflect the complex and multi-layered nature of the work. While it's possible to map out all of the individual events within the film in a granular fashion, a method similar to that of a close reading, perhaps it would be a misguided exercise since the displacement or rupturing of temporality and fictive time is the text's primary operation. And so, a formal reading along those lines would constitute an empty abstraction, an attempt which misses the forest for the trees, the avant-garde equivalent of a CinemaSins breakdown. In other words, it's important to approach the analysis of an experimental film like AlienNATION by considering the overall effect of the film, and not just the individual events within it. It's similar to the distinction between musical notation as a system and the sensory experience of listening to music. The notation on a sheet of music is just a representation of the sounds. It doesn't capture the emotional and sensory experience of actually listening to music. Well-known cultural signifiers are baked into AlienNATION. For example, Beethoven is employed, science fiction movies are used liberally. The employment of these signifiers is decidedly beyond any commercial endeavor. The film is the precise inverse of an advertisement. It's not using these signifiers to sell a product or a message. Instead, the purpose of these signifiers would seem to be highly context-dependent. The video text, as Jameson calls it, suggests a dichotomy between high and mass, read consumer, culture. We can strongly infer that this is the film's general theme. It may be that the video text is exploring in an artistic manner the ways in which these distinctions are constructed and how they shape our understanding of culture and society. This experimental film depicts the constant interplay between various logos or cultural signifiers. It is then necessary to ask how they are connected strictly in the context of the video text. Numerous theoretical frameworks are available in order to make sense of these connections. For example, the logical model of the subject and predicate, upon which theorists have generally drawn a distinction between form and content. Jameson elaborates on the internal operation at play within the video text. He says, "The microscopic, atomic, or isotopic exchange under study here can therefore be nothing less than the capture of one narrative signal by another, the rewriting of one form of narrativization in terms of a different, momentarily more powerful one, the ceaseless re-narrativization of already existent narrative elements by each other." In other words, the film is constantly reworking and reimagining existing narrative elements, and in doing so, it is creating new meanings and context for these elements. The film is not simply telling a traditional narrative, it's constantly shifting and reworking the narrative elements so as to suggest a new and complex web of connections between them. This is a key aspect of experimental films, which often reject traditional narrative structures and instead focus on creating a sense of disorientation and confusion in the viewer. The film is not trying to tell a linear story, but rather create a collage of different elements and narratives that the viewer is supposed to interpret and make sense of. The operation and process here is generally one in which a given sign briefly functions as the interpretant of another, but the sign is subsequently displaced. The signifying chain is constantly shifting in a manner so as to suggest total vertigo. This operation then repels the possibility of any broader meaning. Despite this, it is still possible to focus at the micro level on certain juxtapositions and parse thematic implications. For example, mice are associated with behavioral psychology textbooks so as to suggest a process of conditioning, which is associated with bureaucratic society. It calls to mind the healthcare system in the United States, which, as we all know, is a Kafkaesque network of profit-seeking ventures. Namely, I'm talking about health insurance companies. In the United States, it's fair to say that the average working-class person has been conditioned not to seek treatment for their health problems due to, one might say, sticker shock. In other words, the exorbitant cost of healthcare invariably conditions a vast number of people to wait until their problems are practically unbearable before they seek treatment. And of course, by then, oftentimes it's too late. This is just one sort of thematic connection one might make when it comes to the sight of mice in juxtaposition with behavioral psychology texts. Jameson concludes that the theme of the overall video text is somewhat anticlimactic, given it's right there in the name, alienation, the alienation of an entire nation, as Jameson suggests. Marx spells out his theory of alienation in his economic manuscripts of 1844. Marx's understanding of alienation is a central concept in his critical analysis of capitalist society, especially in his earlier work. According to Marx, alienation refers to the separation of individuals from the product of their labor, from the process of production, from their fellow workers, and from their human nature. Marx argues that in capitalist societies, workers are forced to sell their labor power to capitalists in exchange for wages. They work in conditions over which they have no control, and they are not the owners of the means of production. And so it stands to reason that they are alienated from the product of their labor, since they have no ownership or control over it. They are also alienated from the process of production, as they have no say in how the work is done or how the product is used. Marx also argues that capitalist societies result in alienation from fellow workers, as workers are forced to compete with each other for jobs and wages instead of collaborating. Finally, Marx argues that workers are alienated from their own human nature, as they are stripped of their creativity and autonomy, and thus reduced to mere instruments of production. However, Jameson notes that Marx's concept of alienation is not strictly what's being referred to here, but rather some more general sense of spiritual malaise. It seems that the moments we have identified as potential access points to draw certain conclusions about what the text is really about, there's a sense in which they might be understood as flaws, since they tend to block or interrupt the primary operation of the video text, which is, of course, resisting signification or meaning in general. The goal of this experimental film is not necessarily to convey a clear meaning or message, but to create a sense of confusion and disorientation. The onus is then on the viewer to sit with what they have witnessed and try to contextualize it in their own way. There's a scene in the experimental video where a carton of milk is punctured and the milk spills out onto a table. Subsequently, in another scene, 2 Twinkies are held up. One is slowly compressed with a clamp, and another is abruptly smashed by a human hand. You might think to yourself, what possible meaning is there to be derived from these 2 seemingly random pieces of footage? Jameson suggests a certain historical reference: the assassination of Harvey Milk. A politician named Dan White shot and killed Harvey Milk. He entered an insanity plea in his trial. His legal team claimed he was extremely depressed and not capable of committing premeditated murder, since he wouldn't have been able to plan it out. To support this claim, they pointed towards White's abrupt shift from being extremely health conscious to consuming an excess amount of sugary foods. Instead of a first-degree murder charge, White got a voluntary manslaughter charge, which is much less severe. This came to be known as the Twinkie defense. Given that the carton of milk in Alienation is punctured in a manner similar to a bullet wound, perhaps there is something to this connection. Given the milk Twinkie reference in Alienation, it would then seem that the analysis of certain historical references is another viable interpretive route. You'll find that this is the method of analysis Jameson is most inclined towards. While the problems associated with reference are well known, indeed drawing such connections is generally stigmatized, Jameson identifies historicism as a viable escape route from the double bind of accessing the external world through language. Yet the existence of a buried referent, as Jameson calls it, the milk Twinkie connection, doesn't necessarily get us out of the problem of contextualizing such a referent or locating its cause. Is it a matter of something that is repressed within the text, which is drawn out by the critic? Or rather, is it something imposed on the text by the critic through a process of sublation, a transformative process by which the critic negates the basic reality of the text, or at least certain aspects of the text, and creates something new? The answer is not directly knowable. Another interpretive route is available to us as well, and it's one that emphasizes the mode of production in relation to the text creation, as opposed to any potential message or meaning within the text. This interpretive route is very much related to Marshall McLuhan's idea that the medium is the message. This is the central idea in McLuhan's work on media theory. The idea behind this concept is that the medium of communication itself shapes the message being conveyed and has a greater impact on how it is perceived than the actual content of the message itself. McLuhan argues that the medium of communication, whether it's television, print, or the internet, shapes the way we perceive the world and our relationship to it. According to McLuhan, the medium alters our sense of time and space. It changes the way we think, and it affects our social interactions. McLuhan has been derided as a technological determinist for this view, but Jameson believes it's entirely credible that the subject of all video art is ultimately the technology that enables its very reproduction. Yet Jameson concludes that this is not very helpful for our purposes, as it reduces all video text in the exact same way. Jameson then relays what he calls a useful myth. The concept of the sign was introduced at the dawn of capitalism. What he's referring to here is the formulation of structural linguistics. At this time, the relationship between signs and their reference was, at least notionally, unchallenged. This was enabled through reification, namely the rationalizing operations of Taylorism, particularly specialization and the division of labor. But the operation didn't just stop there. It continued ceaselessly until the sign itself came under scrutiny. And that gave rise to a general incredulity of the idea that you can really access anything true about the external world through language. And now, we're left with postmodernism.